As the global minimum tax on corporations grabs headlines around the world, we've been talking about something similar for a while now. That is the idea that EU citizens could be subject to their own global minimum tax. Today I'm going to clarify my thoughts on exactly what I think about that. Hi, I'm Andrew Henderson. This is Nomad Capitalist, where we help 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors legally go where you're treated best. You can learn more at nomadcapitalist.com. And while the headlines have been on the global minimum tax for big companies, and a lot of people are asking what's going to happen next, I did make a video on this, and we may talk about it more. One thing I've said is I've watched headlines like that, is I've read policy proposals from groups in the European Commission, think tanks in Europe, as I've read the tea leaves from what's coming out of the OECD, the lobbying group for high-tax countries to go and bully countries that wouldn't be competitive. As I look through all this information and my team augments that with their own information gathering, what I have surmised is that there is a chance in the future that either select European Union countries, i.e. Spain, i.e. France, maybe some of the countries that still have a wealth tax, could get together, because most European countries have dropped their wealth tax, which should tell the Elizabeth Warrens of the world something. But maybe some select European Union countries could say, you know what, if you're a Spanish citizen, number one, we're broke, which they're not going to really admit that, but number two, you know what? How patriotic would it be if you, as a Spanish citizen living in Dubai, living in Monaco, living in Panama City, living in Singapore, living in some tax-free or tax-friendly place, how patriotic would it be of you to pay us a certain amount of taxes? Either that approach where it's certain ones of the more egregious countries, or the entire bloc gets together. Now, I think the entire bloc getting together certainly is going to be quite a challenge. You have Poland and Hungary, which seem to block almost everything that comes out these days. But is all of Europe going to say, hey, listen, if you're one of our citizens, if you have an EU passport, you have to pay some kind of minimum tax? It might not be some kind of US-style extraterritorial tax where you've got to pay full boat rates on everything, subject to some exclusions, exemptions, corporations, all of that. But it might be, you know what? There are certain programs, there are certain countries in the world where they say, okay, listen, you've got to pay 5% for this or 10% for that. That's what it could be. And so if you are, someone who wants to legally reduce your taxes as much as possible, I have said that perhaps, and I have not predicted this, but I think it possibly could be coming in the next 5, 10, 15 years, even 20 years, there could be a time when more of these countries come out and say, that's how we're going to do it. Now, do I think that Canada or Australia or a country like that would do it first? Yeah, probably. Now, certainly a lot of these countries don't have the enforcement mechanism that the United States is, where they can just go and not only have IRS offices around the world, they can go and create laws like FATCA that make all the financial institutions of the world report to them. It's going to be harder for for even France, or let alone Bulgaria or Estonia to do that on their own. If the EU got together, could they do that? Could they pressure organizations around the world to share information? Could they pressure their citizens to do it upon not renewing their passport? There's all kinds of things that could happen. I don't know exactly what it would look like, but I've said, hey, this is something that can happen. And so what I've suggested is, if you are a Westerner, forget Americans, because they already know with certainty what they're dealing with in terms of taxes on passive and active income. But if you are another Western citizen, especially the English-speaking countries, you should consider having a second passport. Now, talked to a guy recently. He's got $2 million. He's Canadian. He's going to live overseas. And, the idea of going out and spending 150 grand on a passport, 7 or 8% of his net worth, probably not that urgent, especially when he's largely in crypto and he thinks the 2 million becomes 10 million. And so the opportunity cost is too high. I said, listen, maybe we look at a paper residence program. Maybe we look at a cheaper way to get some kind of insurance policy in case the Canadian politicians on today's fringe have their way and impose some kind of extraterritorial taxation because, hey, we can't let these Canadians overseas be freeloading. I think it's definitely more likely outside of the European Union, but I think the EU could eventually get around to some form of this. It may not be nearly as egregious, but people have come to me and said, well, wait a second, Andrew, I want to get a Maltese citizenship by investment. Or, I'm looking at the Bulgaria program, I'm looking at the Portugal program. Hey, I'm entitled to Italian citizenship by descent. My thoughts have been this. Number one, if you're entitled to citizenship by descent, I generally take free passports that are offered to me. Citizenship by descent is slower, so if you're looking for a second passport for financial reasons, you're probably not going to want to wait around 2, 3, 4 years to get your citizenship by descent, especially as some of them are starting to reject people in some cases, or they want you to learn the language. I wouldn't pass up a free passport unless it was Iran or Syria or something where you would, get in trouble. You could always decide, I don't want to be Italian, I don't want to be, Latvian later. Would I spend the money? And this is an interesting question. I had a conversation with a guy recently where he said, you know what, if a rule like this came in where I had a tax issue in the next 10 years, it may not be worth it. What I convinced him, number one, was look away from like a program like Malta where it's a donation, where if you do believe that a tax like this is going to come out in the next 10 years, having a Maltese citizenship with $1 million price tag, you're kind of basically getting like a leasehold passport where for the next 10 years, you're just kind of leasing access to travel the world as a European, go to the US visa-free, live anywhere you want in Europe, if you were going to eventually give it up. Programs like Bulgaria, programs like Portugal, other golden visas that could lead to citizenship, other naturalization programs through freelancer visas, independent means visas, etc., wouldn't require nearly as much of an investment of money, but would require an investment of time. And so I've been thinking about this as I spent some time in Ireland recently, a country that I love, and I've always loved for many, many years. And I'm thinking, like, where do I really see this going? And really trying to read more material that's coming out. And here's my thought. Number one, the chances that this entire tax stuff could come out, I don't think it's anywhere near 100%. So I wouldn't be freaking out. What I also think, however, is, in the same way that you saw in the latest round of offshore papers that South Dakota in the United States is now one of the biggest offshore quote-unquote havens. The United States is not beating itself up for being a place people store their money offshore, but they certainly are going out with all these other groups and beating up people in these little islands, which are much smaller tax havens by comparison. And so my thought process as I read this stuff and I parse the information and I talk to people I know who are smart is, having a European Union passport, again, I think is probably not a lot of risk in the near term. I think in the mid and long term, there could be some risk, especially if you're in some of the more high tax countries, like a Netherlands, a Spain, a Germany, a France, etc. The smaller countries that need to be competitive, the less developed countries, I see it as a lesser risk, again, until they do this Herculean task of all getting together. But I think that what sweetens the pot for me, if you're going to be an EU citizen, is wanting to live in the European Union somewhere, wanting to live within the EEA. And here's why I think why I believe that. For the same reason that the U.S. is not going to go and really do any substantial policing of South Dakota or Delaware or whatever else while they're out there complaining about all the other tax havens. If you're an EU citizen, I think just the way that it's set up, it's going to be difficult to say, listen, if you go to Ireland and avail of their tax incentives, or if you go to Portugal and avail of their tax incentives, there may be some push to stop some of those. But obviously, countries like Switzerland have long established lump sum programs. You've got tax incentives in an increasing number of European countries right now that I don't think you're going to be able to get rid of. And so if the idea is, listen, I'm going to become Maltese, I'm going to become Bulgarian, Portuguese, whatever else that I'm entitled to or I can invest my way to, and then I'm going to use that as a way to live in, establish tax residence, have a base as part of my trifecta in a European country. I think that's definitely more palatable than saying, I'm going to go out and get a Maltese citizenship and then go and live in Dubai. Do I think, again, there's a high risk in the next 5 years or even 10 years that being a citizen of a country like Malta, or ever, by the way, Malta, Bulgaria, etc., will be an issue? Again, I see it more possible on a country-by-country basis. I just think that it's obviously easier to enforce if they can get every country together, which I think will be very, very difficult, but possible. And so if the worst came to pass and you were, a Maltese citizen and you went to live in Dubai or you went to live in Vanuatu or you went to live in Panama and you were paying zero, I think that's a bigger target than someone who says, I'm going to become Maltese and then I'm going to go and live in Ireland and take advantage of their very generous tax regime for people who aren't Irish. And I think that just the way the EU works together, that would be seen as much more palatable. And so, if the goal is not to live in Europe, then I think that your risk factor is slightly higher. Again, much lower in the countries where they are eager to attract business, hence why they have residence or citizenship programs. And so, I wouldn't be doing a ton of planning around this right now, other than if I'm European, I would be taking at least a cheap way to have an insurance policy. And what I've said in my ultimate plan B video is if you can afford to go out and become Maltese through their MEIN citizenship program, you can afford to add on Antigua or St. Kitts or something else where you have a plan B to your plan B. I would not, if I could afford, if I felt comfortable spending the money on Malta. By the way, I had a guy the other day, this guy's got $100 million. He said, I'm not spending $1 million. What are you kidding me? I said, but you want to give up your U.S. citizenship. He said, hey, listen, I'll come back some other way. It's not worth $1 million. It's not worth 1% of my net worth. So if it's not worth it to you, then it's not worth it. But my point is, I would not necessarily shy away from doing this, but I would have a backup plan. I wouldn't simply, as I've always said, go from being I'm going to be an American to I'm going to be Maltese. I would always want to have redundancies. And as people say, well, hey, there's fewer places to go and they're closing the exits. I don't agree with that necessarily, but I do think that having backup plans on backup plans is not a bad idea. And if I'm already a European citizen, I'm not going to necessarily rush out and get a second citizenship. For many people like Germans and Dutch, it's very difficult to go out and get a Caribbean citizenship, for example. But I would get started on, if I'm already European or if I'm getting European, in a cheap way, I'm going to tack on a paper residence. I'm going to go and possibly naturalize in a more tax-friendly country. Maybe if I'm going where some of the freedom seekers are going right now, I'm going to go and live in Nicaragua for a while, learn Spanish and become a citizen there. And that's going to give me the personal freedom. Or I'm going to go and live in another country that has low taxes and become a citizen there. So I would have backup plans to backup plans. I don't know that the risk, I've told people in person, the risk could be 10%, 20%, something like that. And again, maybe it's really only that high in certain countries. But understand that Europe has a risk, both on a financial level and a freedom level. There are certain places in Europe that I like a lot, Ireland being one of them, that do offer good incentives. And so I think that the benefit of being European, as much as it seems obvious, is the ability to live in Europe. If you're not seeking that, and you're solely seeking it for the ability of replacing, let's say, a US passport, then you accept a slightly higher risk. If you're willing to take that risk on, then you should hedge the risk. If not, you should simply go somewhere else. Those are my thoughts on the EU and what's coming. It's certainly very fluid and can change as I see more stuff coming out of the regulatory bodies there, as I observe more of what they're doing. Obviously, you've got a fight in the EU where you've got countries that really don't want other countries to be competitive. They've cracked down on places like Andorra in the past. They probably don't really like what's happening in places like Bulgaria. You saw what they did with Ireland and their corporate tax rate. So it certainly is a battle. It's going to be interesting to see what happens. Those are my thoughts as of today. Don't stop now. We've got well over 1,000 more videos here on YouTube for you to watch and learn how to go where you're treated best. And if you want to work with Nomad Capitalist personally, go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply. Learn about our unique, tried and true process, garnered over years of experience, and learn how you can become our client.